I think it's analogous to the war on cancer, that we had this illusion for a while that we could cure cancer with a magic vaccine, kind of like polio, and it didn't work out. Cancer has taken us 40 years of basic research, during which we've gotten a bit better at dealing with treating individual cases. But it's going to be at least another 20, 30 years before we figure this out. Conflict's going to be like this. It's going to take 30, 40 years, and we have to really be prepared for a long-haul, well-funded project that slowly develops the basic research that we need to really understand human interactions and why people behave the way they do. And that slowly translates that into intervention strategies that teach people how to do things better. And if I could be really successful, if I could just get people starting, I'm thinking about this as a big, long-term problem, rather than just something that's disagreeable that you have to live with. I'm an instructor with the Peace and Conflict Studies program at the university. I'm also co-director of something called the Conflict Information Consortium. It's a 20-year-old project at the University of Colorado. And that's really been focused on really kind of systematically trying to identify and then make available over the web more constructive approaches to a broad range of social conflict and social justice issues. And part of the goal is to obviously reduce the incidence of violent conflict, but not just in a way that suppresses conflict. I think what you really want to do is to build what we call constructive confrontation skills, so people know how to really try to struggle against injustice and really advance what might be called social learning. Conflict isn't in itself a bad thing, but it can certainly be unnecessarily destructive. It can certainly have lots of adverse consequences and wind up not producing a whole lot in the way of positive change. But you don't want to get the idea that justice is sort of an impossible to define thing. So what we focus on is not so much attaining utopian justice, that will leave to your generation, but instead focus on how do we really address the most egregious acts of injustice. And if we can do that, we've accomplished a lot.
Well, come on, all of you big, strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. Got himself in a terrible jam way down yonder in Vietnam.
At this time, the thing to do to oppose the war was to break up all the stores on the hill. So there are these murals on the front of the Colorado bookstore now on giant cinder block walls. They used to be glass windows, and they were all broken. There used to be a bank where Art Hardware, and now there's something else there, a Princeton Review or something. And folks took sledgehammers to the bulletproof glass. They had one helicopter running full-time back and forth to Denver with loads of tear gas. You had another helicopter circling over the hill with a giant searchlight looking for, trying to spotlight hippies. And you had machine gun nests at the courthouse. They were afraid there was going to be a run on the jail, which was at the courthouse. But all of that was just sort of angry, and nobody really quite understood what was going on and how we backed into Vietnam. So I guess the moral of all of that was, it's easy to feel really self-righteous about all that, but there wasn't that much of a strategy, and certainly no understanding of the conflict. And people, it was a primal scream kind of thing, that you were angry, and maybe the war ended because of it, but after 10 years and 60,000 Americans killed and God knows how many Vietnamese. Homer Page, who used to be a county commissioner in Boulder, came to one of our things and coined what he called the primal scream syndrome, which is where you just come and you want people to know that you're mad, but you don't really want to understand and try to figure out how to solve it. And too much of the peace movement still doesn't really want to grapple with how difficult and daunting the problem is. And it doesn't tend to give people who approach it from other perspectives really the respect they deserve and listen as much as they should. And the people who do that are the people who are making a real difference. When they first built it, the headline in the Denver Post was, "Good news, atom plant comes to Denver." So they built this place, and then it lapsed into deep secrecy, and at this point people were getting smarter about anti-war protests. And these were focused on really drawing the public's attention to the fact that we were building enough bombs to end life on this planet for all practical purposes. And the nuclear arms race, especially early in the Reagan era, was frightening. Just as Vietnam was punctuated by a whole series of demonstrations and crises and efforts, there were a whole series that were directed against the nuclear arms race. But there are a few things that they did that were smarter. One is they always treated the workers out there with respect. They always, it was all about converting Rocky Flats to peaceful uses. There were protests. There was one where, and what they kept trying to do was to do something illegal out there, get arrested, get put on trial, where they could then put the whole weapons complex on trial. And there's a lesser evils defense, that it's okay to do something illegal if you're trying to prevent something that's more illegal. So you kept trying to do that, and they were never able to. But you'd work out these deals, and they'd negotiate with Rocky Flats on exactly how a protest was going to work. They'd have all the fences set up. But there was one case where they went out and everybody did a sit-in to get arrested properly, and it was all, and somebody screwed up the paperwork. So they came back the next day and they did it all over. And everybody knew. They baked cakes for all the guards ahead of time, and so there were, the Rocky Flats folks actually set up a place on the plant site to have demonstrations. What was interesting was they didn't agree with the protesters, but they listened. And they were thoughtful, and you can tell they struggled with it. There was a maturity to it, and there was a sense in which people were starting to understand that this is about persuasion, and starting to understand the importance of treating people with respect, and separate the people from the problem, and trying to focus on really what's the key to national security, and understand the escalation dynamics. Nobody ever thought that we would ever close Rocky Flats and quit making nuclear weapons. The fact that Ronald Reagan arranged that, and there's a whole story about, you can worry about how he did it, but it's still an enormous accomplishment. And part of what came out of the Vietnam era, and really starting in the early 80s, was really the development of a field of dispute resolution in the United States that has become increasingly institutionalized, where folks actually are trying to apply these things. So there is a sense in which it has been institutionalized. And there are lots of associations that really focus on these things. So trying to make those processes better and work better and listen to complaints and figure out how to improve things is still doing the same stuff. But ultimately the goal of this is to change society, which means institutionalizing things and being part of society rather than just being the sort of wacky hippie that goes around with the sign and says everything's messed up. All of them. I mean, there's this classic wave diagram where there's the period of conflict emergence. And at that stage, conflict prevention technology is the way to go. Then at the next level, you get to a period of intense conflict. This is where violence tends to break out. Things get very ugly there, and then you need a bunch of conflict resolution skills. And then you have, assuming you're successful there, then you have the third stage, which is the post-conflict reconstruction reconciliation phase. And at that phase, you're really trying to be a conflict prevention too, because it could all start all over again. The information structure of the conflict field is very different from other fields. Conflict, everybody deals with conflict. So you need to get the information to lots of people. And the sources of information are also very widely dispersed. It includes scientific research. It includes a lot of just sort of cultural traditions and religion, and so it comes from really all aspects of society. So you have a many-to-many information transfer problem. The other thing is there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So exactly what you need to know is very different depending upon where you are. So now we're trying to build these diagnostic tools that basically will give people instant access to mini lessons on a particular problem. All right, we have this vision of making an online textbook that really offers a different way of thinking about this. Conflict is a global warming class problem. And that if you look 100 years out and you ask, what happens if we decide to blow off all this global warming stuff? It's pretty ugly. If you look at what happens 100 years out if we decide we're not going to worry about infectious disease risks or poverty or these things, it's all pretty ugly. But if we don't get better at dealing with conflict, we can't solve any of those problems. So our pitch is that we're trying to elevate conflict to a global warming class problem.